Every February, the city of Dresden turns into a freak show. Over the years, from the 90s to today, drunkard, violent skinheads turned into black-clad far-right rioters to identitarians, turning up every year to proclaim the supposed solemn commemorations for the people killed during the bombing of Dresden from the 13th to the 15th of February 1945. Every year it turns into a ridiculous mess, and the few people I know from Dresden myself have repeatedly told me how sick they are of it themselves. The city of Dresden itself has repeatedly failed in dealing with this freak show, even on some occasions becoming part of it, like when local representatives and press organized a candle vigil only to be joined by Nazis. Most people dismiss revisionism, but when it comes to Dresden, the myth and culture of victimization has persisted, carried on, and is kept onward, and nobody seems to bother to even question why. For some reason, Dresden keeps being brought up in debates about morality of tactics in war, and remains a point from which extremists argue about a supposed war crime committed by the Allies. And from my perspective, it's a sideshow. An irrelevance. The bombing of Dresden has been torn out of the hands of historians to be used and abused by those with political agendas. And I will attempt here in this video to try to explain to you why the bombing of Dresden being discussed in the modern day is due to a propaganda myth and a distortion of history, and why in the wider context of the Allied bombing campaign it is also far less relevant. If you want to know why Dresden is brought up by some even to this day, I would like to recommend to you to visit the city of Dresden yourself. Visit the central cemetery, Heidefriedhof, and go to the Stellenfeld, where you will find this marble rondel with an eternal flame in the middle surrounded by 14 blocks. This place is intended as a memorial to the victims of the Second World War by the city. 7 of the blocks are inscribed with Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Ravensbrück, Sachsenhausen and Theresienstadt to represent and commemorate the victims of the Holocaust. 4 blocks are inscribed with Coventry, Leningrad, Rotterdam and Warsaw to represent and commemorate the massacres of civilians in cities by the German armed forces. 2 blocks are inscribed with Lidice and Oradour to represent and commemorate the victims of massacres by the SS. And 1 block carries the inscription Dresden. And this right here is the reason why Dresden still comes up and is subject of debate to this day. This memorial was built in 1965 by the East German communist regime with a propaganda motive in mind. But let's wind back a bit before the East German regime to the bombing of Dresden itself. After the bombing nights from the 13th to 15th of February, the Nazi propaganda machine under Goebbels went on a public information assault, declaring Dresden an innocent victim of war, a city of culture brutally destroyed by barbaric Britons and Americans, killing hundreds of thousands. In reality, 25,000 were killed. The Goebbels propaganda itself was little of use in the end. By February 1945, the war was all but lost, and only a few months away from its conclusion. But the narrative spun by Goebbels 2 months before defeat resurfaced during the Cold War. After the war, the East German regime stylized itself as the bulwark against fascism, and more specifically as the supposed forefront against the fascist supporters and tendencies of capitalism. Dresden was decried by the communists as an innocent victim of Anglo-American bombing terror. Methods and narratives of propaganda were on occasion directly taken from prior Nazi propaganda. The narratives were constructed that the bombing of Dresden was conducted by the Allies to intimidate the advancing Red Army and to leave the Soviet sphere of influence over Germany in ruins. This is a narrative and an attitude found all across the East German regime starting from the 1950s. Many don't know that the official name of what is commonly known as the Berlin Wall was Antifaschistischer Schutzwall, or the Anti-Fascist Wall of Protection. The wall in reality prevented people from escaping the country, but officially it was deemed as a measure to protect socialism from fascism and its supposed enabler, the West. But the most grotesque and sinister misuse of commemoration by the East German regime is to be found in Buchenwald. Memorials in concentration camps are usually solemn. In Buchenwald, the East German regime did something different. Buchenwald was unique in that it was the only concentration camp that liberated itself, when inmates stormed the armory, chased off the guards, and took control of the camp when the American forces were only a few days away. This sequence of events would later be shamelessly exploited by the East German regime, which stylized immortalized themselves as the inheritors of a struggle fought by the concentration camp inmates. Rather than building a memorial, the camp became a weird site of pilgrimage for socialist youth members, and annual events professing the supposed continuation of a struggle against fascism started in the camp and continued against the West by the East German regime, reaching so low as to have the soldiers of the East German army swear their oath of loyalty and allegiance in the camp as a symbol of supposed continued struggle. It is this aspect of history that is often forgotten, the history of telling history, which in itself, and especially in this case, became part of history. This is the reason why the bombing of Dresden still is brought up today as a supposed moral issue in debates over the efficacy and morality of actions and tactics during war, in what appears to be an almost endless tug between two camps over an ideological mission. The people who participate in this debate also seem to be blissfully unaware that the reason Dresden as a topic of controversy was kept alive is not due to a genuine debate, but due to the propaganda efforts of a regime that took this narrative from another authoritarian regime. While to me personally, the ideological abuse of this event throughout the last 60 years has somewhat become more relevant than the event itself in the debates of the current day and age. History does not follow an ideology, and the reason for why Dresden happened are not to be argued for by making a moral case, let alone found. Why did the bombing of Dresden happen? There is never one single reason as to why historic events happen, always many, and I will try to give you some. To understand the events leading up to the bombing of Dresden, I believe we need to turn back the clock to April 1937 and to a different war. In 1936, right at the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, the nationalists under command of Franco requested support by the fascist governments of Mussolini and Hitler, Germany sending the Legion Condor, a unit of German bombers, fighters and crew, to engage in the strategic bombing of Republican positions in Spain. By April 1937, nationalist forces surrounded and then further advanced upon Republican positions in the Basque country, planning an assault on the Basque capital, Bilbao. The Spanish High Command requested a targeted bombing of the bridge and road heading through the town of Guernica. We know from the diaries of the commanders in charge that the bridge and roads were the intended target, but when the German bomber fleet approached the town, either through the dust of a previous bombing raid or by other reason, the incendiary bombs they dropped scattered all over the town and leveled it to the ground, with hundreds of civilians killed. The weapons factories and much of the infrastructure of the town had survived, while 3/4 of the town's civilian homes had been destroyed. The mission was deemed a failure by the German High Command. The German Air Force had been rebuilt largely by General Walter Wever, who had also finalized the military doctrines of that Air Force, which was strategic bombing, the destruction of targets of military value, such as arms factories, roads, troops, positions, bridges, troop supplies, and other, by specific targeted bomb strikes. And according to that military doctrine, the mission in Guernica was a complete failure. But on the ground, the town fell. The survivors lost all will to fight. The remaining Republican troops ran and left the destroyed town behind. Franco's troops were able to take the town with no resistance. The goals of the mission may have failed, but the effects of the bombing brought victory nonetheless. While Wever's doctrines for bombing still remained a cornerstone of the German Air Force, someone else started creeping into the picture: the Italian general Giulio Douhet, who had written his doctrines of aerial warfare in the 1920s, where he proposed morale bombing, to send vast fleets of heavy bombers to deliberately lay waste to civilian towns and inflict massive damage and horror upon the civilian population. The consequence of which, he argued, would be a civilian loss of morale, which would pressure the government into suing for peace. This idea started falling upon open ears within German High Command after Guernica. What if it was true? The country had already been geared up to war by its leaders. And what if that war could be shortened by the deliberate and indiscriminate bombardment of civilians? There was little regard for Polish life and for the Polish people in the German High Command, whose leaders considered the Poles to be a subhuman race. When the war started, this new doctrine was ruthlessly applied. Planes were no longer just sent out to pick off strategic targets of military value, but to terrorize a people into surrender. You have probably at some point in your life heard these sounds. As well as this one. What many don't know is that these are movie tropes. Planes don't howl like sirens when in a steep dive, and bombs don't generally whistle when being dropped to the ground. The reason why we associate these sounds with these things is because the German Air Force created them. The Jericho horns were attached to Stuka bombers specifically to create that sound as they dove down toward their targets, to terrorize those below before they dropped their bombs. Whistles were attached to bombs by German bomber pilots to deliberately create a shrieking, whistling sound upon dropping bombs, also to deliberately terrorize those below. This was done as part of changing the air war into a war of terror. This here is one of the most important pictures of the Second World War, and one of the most important documents in the history of aerial bombardment, and it is unfortunately not very well known. It's a picture of Warsaw, taken by a German reconnaissance plane. Within it, the areas heavily populated by civilians are marked out. Additionally, areas with large Jewish populations are especially marked and numbered. These pictures were handed out to German bomber pilots prior to their air raids on Warsaw, the intention being to show these pilots where civilians were and where most of the Jews of Warsaw lived, so that they could deliberately drop their bombs on these areas. And it was Warsaw which at the beginning of the war became a symbol to the world for the horrors of morale bombing. The city was surrounded by the German army and relentlessly bombed and shelled, under Hitler's orders to besiege and starve the city. When the city surrendered, many within German high command deemed it a success of morale bombing. However, factors not taken into account were that the city had been surrounded and artillery shelling had also been used in what became a hopeless struggle for Warsaw and its defenders. Nonetheless, the morale bombing doctrines also found its application on the Western Front upon the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Targeted bombing against French and British military targets were accompanied by Jericho horns and whistling bombs that terrorized the troops beneath. The German Air Force also set out to bomb civilian towns and the endless columns of French refugees. Later, it would often be denied that these pilots had intentionally bombed civilians, but the Germans' own propaganda movies showing the German army's advance into France ironically proved that the pilots knew what they were dropping the bombs on. However, declaring the invasion of France a victory of morale bombing leaves out the enormous list of other failings and shortcomings by the Allied forces. The more famous example of morale bombing on the Western Front was the bombing of Rotterdam. On the 14th of May 1940, just 6 days after the invasion of the Netherlands had started, a German air fleet laid waste to Rotterdam in a massive air raid. The bombing was followed by an ultimatum by the head of the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, to the Dutch High Command, that if the Dutch army should not surrender, what had been done to Rotterdam would be done to every single Dutch city. The Dutch army surrendered, but as much as this may look as a success for morale bombing, and as much as Göring may have believed it to be so, it's a deceiving conclusion. The goal of morale bombing is to bomb the civilian population into losing the will to fight, and consequently pressuring the government into surrender. However, in this case, the high command of the Dutch army made the decision to surrender, not the population at large. The Dutch people had no say in this surrender, and the Dutch royal family and government fled to Britain with much of the Dutch fleet, rather than surrendering with the Dutch army. We will probably never know if the bombing of Rotterdam strengthened or weakened the resolve of the Dutch civilian. Contrary to popular perception, the Battle of Britain started initially as a strategic bombing campaign by the Germans. The intention of the German High Command was to destroy air bases of the Royal Air Force on the ground with a coordinated targeted bombing campaign, to cripple the Royal Air Force, and then proceed to destroy the Royal Navy from the air, so neither would stand in the way of a German landing and subsequent invasion. On the 24th of August, the German bombing fleet, after getting lost over England, confused the lights of London with their actual target and dropped the bombs over the city. The officers were repudiated, as this was not the intended target, even summoned to Berlin for possible punishment. However, London reacted by sending a Royal Air Force bomber fleet on a night raid over Berlin. That raid did not cause much damage, but caused Hitler to personally interfere within the plans of the German Air Force, demanding morale bombing raids over British cities, which were carried out during what became known as the Blitz. A campaign of morale bombing that was intended to shatter the morale of the British public and therefore smash their will to keep fighting. But in the case of the Battle of Britain, the opposite started happening. The population started rallying in support of the war, confronted with the horrors brought to their doorstep by German bombers. The Royal Air Force, who had previously seen their bases destroyed and were at the brink of defeat, took advantage of the break of having their bases bombed and rallied, reorganized, and kept the fight going. The Germans lost. Morale bombing had failed, and demonstrably so, not only by not achieving the goals in mind, but by drawing out the battle and thereby losing it. The German Air Force, however, stuck to these tactics. Mostly unheard of in popular history in the Western world is the morale bombing that took place at the Eastern Front. And it is there at the Eastern Front where it took its worst form during the bombings of cities such as Leningrad and Stalingrad. The orders given to the troops besieging and bombing the cities were to exterminate entire populations. The bombings of civilians in Leningrad and Stalingrad and several other Soviet cities from 1941 to 1942 were not merely conducted to decrease morale, but with the extermination of the civilian population as part of the goal. And it is important to know that morale bombing continued to be conducted by the German Air Force right up until they no longer had the capacity to do so. The often forgotten Little Blitz of January 1944, when despite having almost no Air Force left, the war being almost lost and an Allied victory was only a few months away, is an example of how these tactics and doctrines were kept in place to the very last. Additionally, the German armed forces kept firing V-1 and V-2 rockets into British, French and Belgian cities until the end of the war. Weapons which had no targeting system besides the estimated location of a city, meaning that these could only have been used as random weapons of terror. As to the question of who started it, it is possible to give a very clear answer. The Germans. Their air force conducted the deliberate bombing of civilian targets from the start, right up to the very end of the war. On the Allied side, British Bomber Command rejected the idea of morale bombing and insisted on sticking to strategic bombing as the main tactics of the Royal Air Force bombers. The first bombing raids were flown in 1939 by daylight and ended in disaster. Out of 36 bombers, 29 were shot down. Daylight raids were immediately abandoned. Bombing raids would from then on only be conducted at night. And with the retreat of Allied forces from Europe, Bomber Command was the only fighting force left that could take the fight effectively to Germany. With that mounting pressure, air raids over the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley and northern Germany were conducted, with the intention not to bomb civilians, but oil plants, refineries, factories, docks, steel mills, and rail yards. Even though these campaigns were celebrated as success in the British media and by the government, by 1941 reconnaissance flights revealed that most of the bombs had missed their targets. Only 1 in 4 bombers hit their targets. Night bombing provided difficulties in navigation and targeting for which the Royal Air Force had no response at the time. And this campaign came at the loss of 700 bombers and their crews. Consequently, all air raids over Germany were halted by the end of 1941. For a time, Bomber Command was almost dissolved and its planes and crews almost redirected to the Royal Army and Navy to provide support for their armed forces. However, a member of Churchill's government, Lord Cherwell, had a different idea. He studied the effects of the German bombing of British cities, summarized his findings, and presented them to the cabinet in a paper he wrote with the simple title, Dehousing. Its content and the argument was simple. It boiled bombing campaigns down to a mathematical calculation. Homelessness and destruction of industry became digits in a calculation in which Cherwell argued that the German war effort could be substantially hindered by making its workers homeless. The head of Bomber Command, Marshal Hewitt, was sacked and later replaced with Marshal Arthur Harris, who set out to implement a plan of aerial bombing of German cities. The test run was conducted in March 1942 against the coastal city of Lübeck. 300 people were killed and 15,000 lost their homes. By this time, German bombers had been conducting bombing raids of civilians for 3 years, and as the British bombing raids continued in subsequent years over Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, Dresden, and other German cities, a difference in attitude between the two air forces was still noticeable. The German leadership often lied to its public about the bombing campaigns, denying the deliberate targeting of civilians. The German raids, especially on the Eastern Front, were part of a wider war of extermination, not only driven by a motivation to defeat the enemy, but to destroy the civilian population as a goal for a subsequent peace without them. British Bomber Command did not lie to the public about their targets. The bombers were celebrated by the public as the only ones able to take the fight to the enemy before 1944, and later in the war even protested. Bomber Command's goal was the destruction of the German war industry by destroying the workers' ability to work, and the planning was conducted on the basis of cold, hard, and ruthless calculations. For the Germans, ideological goals, however, took precedent over strategic goals. After the entry of the United States into the war, the US Air Force started stationing bombers in the United Kingdom in 1942, conducting small raids targeting docks and submarine bases in occupied France. The Americans entered the bombing war convinced that they could do what the British failed at, precision bombing by daylight, with their new Norton bomb sights that had been tested to be extremely accurate in the United States. However, the bomb sights were tested in the clear skies of Arizona, not in the clouded skies of Northern Europe and the German anti-aircraft fire, and hounded by German fighters. The consequent precision daylight raids over Germany by the US Air Force ended in disaster, finding its grim climax in the Schweinfurt raid of 1943, when 376 American bombers were sent to destroy a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt. At a cost of 60 bombers and 585 crewmen, the factory was repaired and resumed work the same day it was bombed. Consequently, several months later, and despite the obvious dangers that came with doing so, a second raid was ordered by US command. Of 291 bombers, 77 were lost, with casualties in crew being 698. The Americans failed at the strategic bombing just as the British had failed before them. While at first denying to the public that the US Air Force would conduct large-scale bombings of German cities, the US Air Force equipped its bombers with radars required for such missions, armed them with newly made firebombs, and joined the Royal Air Force conducting large-scale firebombings of cities and towns in 1943. There's therefore, in conclusion, a point that can be legitimately made, that if the Germans didn't want their cities bombed, they shouldn't have started bombing cities themselves. However, as mentioned before, there is an underlying truth here, a fact, a difference between the bombing campaigns conducted by the Allies and the Luftwaffe. The main focus of Allied bombing campaigns remained military infrastructure and its industry, the bombing of shore installations during D-Day, the bombing of oil fields in Romania, and after the liberation of Italy, the bombings of armament factories in Austria and Bavaria all prove this. At the start of the Second World War, the Germans had one of the most effective air forces in the world, with some of the best planes. Polish double-deckers were no match to German fighters. The Dutch Air Force was destroyed by German bombers on the ground before it could effectively join the fight. The French Air Force, neglected before the war, was managed incompetently and was largely outdated and in the middle of modernizing upon the German invasion, during which a large part of the French Air Force was destroyed on the ground. The remaining French planes, such as the Morane, may have been superior to German fighters, but the rapid advance of German ground forces caused havoc and confusion as pilots were forced to find new airfields and squadrons that were flung into chaos. The loss on ground made the victory in the air impossible. It wasn't until 1940 over Britain where the Germans encountered an air force on more equal terms in battle, and where I believe one can find one of the additional reasons for why Dresden happened: the technology. Focusing on the bombers, the probably most iconic German bomber is the Heinkel 111. It took part in the bombing raids over Poland, Belgium, Norway, the Netherlands, France, Britain, and Russia. But take a closer look at it. The Heinkel was built while there were treaties in place limiting the amount of bombers in the German Air Force. Consequently, the Germans built them with the intention of disguising them as transport planes, a disguise that limited its capacity. Bombers were also loaded in a vertical position, limiting the capacity of bombs that could be carried. The other bombers used by the Germans early in the war were the U-88, which was a dive bomber, ideal for diving down onto ships and ground military targets for precise targeting, but severely limited in the amount of bombs it could carry, and consequently the devastation it could cause to a city. The Dornier 17 was also a medium bomber, built to violate international treaties in disguise by disguising it as a mail plane. Its bomb load was also limited, and long-range raids required half the bomb bay to be occupied by a massive secondary fuel tank. The Stuka was incredibly effective against troops, tanks, ships, and other enemy positions, but to destroy cities it was simply too small, and when confronted with an effective opposing fighter, it was basically a sitting duck. This fleet of medium bombers and light bombers may have been ideal for frontline duties in blitzkrieg tactics, certainly effective also with accompanying troops in bombing cities, certainly also effective in bombing cities when accompanied by troops and artillery. But for long-range attacks against cities, a heavy bomber fleet is required that can carry heavy weights of bombs, fly long distances, fly at night, and fly at high altitudes. And this is where the Germans failed. In our modern perception, we often see things through the lens of there being a supposed superiority in German engineering. But during World War II, a simple fact is that the British and Americans had and built the better planes. The British bomber fleet also started the war with medium bombers, which were quickly shown ineffective during long-range bombing raids and consequently repurposed for frontline support, reconnaissance, and submarine hunting. Instead, the Royal Air Force started developing heavy four-engine bombers such as the Halifax and Lancaster. Big carrying capacity, large fuel tanks, high altitude, and constant modernization of radar and other equipment quickly gave the Royal Air Force a cutting edge over the German Luftwaffe bombers. And what were the German heavy bombers? Good question. The four-engine Condor was a transatlantic passenger plane repurposed for the war. It didn't have the capacity for heavy bomb loads and was therefore mainly used for reconnaissance over the Atlantic, finding British and American ships for submarines. Its lack of defense also meant that once found, most would end up sinking beneath the waves off the coast of Ireland. Same goes for the U-290, also a passenger plane repurposed for war, incapable of carrying heavy bomb loads and therefore used as reconnaissance. And the German heavy bomber projects developed during the war were failures. The Heinkel 177, a German heavy bomber, was made with Göring constantly interfering in the planning and design, insisting that it should be capable of handling the missions of both a heavy and a dive bomber, resulting in a large plane with two massive propellers and four engines. It may look nice and like a semi-decent heavy bomber, however its nicknames given to it by German pilots were Reichsfackel, Reichsfeuerzeug, and Brennender Sarg, or Torch of the Empire, Imperial Cigarette Lighter, or Burning Coffin. The reason being that because of Göring's interference and rejection of a four-propeller plane, the plane had to be built with two heavy engines running one massive propeller, which led to the engines overheating during long flights, igniting the oil tanks. Basically, the plane had a tendency to have the engines randomly go up in flames after 4 hours of flight. It had successful missions, mainly sinking ships in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, but when it came to the bombing of cities such as the Little Blitz of 1944, it had to fly long ranges. It still had to fly to London side by side with outdated medium bombers, and by that time the Royal Air Force had advanced its night fighter technology to such an extent that out of 547 German bombers that took part in this raid, 329 were shot down. The technological advantage also saw the Royal Air Force taking large leaps ahead in other ways. Large bundles of aluminium strips released over Germany hopelessly confused the German radar. British radar technology, already superior before the war, kept advancing throughout it, guiding bombers to their destinations. Even the bombs themselves are where the Royal Air Force kept ahead. German incendiary bombs were round, while British incendiary bombs were hexagonal. Might not seem very important until you stack them together, as they would have been in the bomb bay, and you realize that it was far more efficient for the British. A simple fact is that the Germans would have, without a doubt, leveled even more cities, with even more civilian casualties, if they had had the opportunity to do so. But they didn't get that opportunity, because they lost the technology race. And this is just another very simple reason as to why the bombing of Dresden happened, but is often ignored. It also leads us to another reason: the incompetence of the leadership of the German Luftwaffe. By 1943, the Royal Air Force was probably the single most effective and efficient air force in the world, with competent commanders, well-trained pilots, and a large arsenal of modern and effective planes. At around the same time, the German Luftwaffe started to be reduced to a shambles, and a lot of that decline had to do with the mismanagement and incompetence of the leadership. If you watch interviews with Royal Air Force pilots and with Luftwaffe pilots, there is something that will become somewhat of a pattern and that will stand out to you. The British veterans speak with a glaring and universal admiration of their commanders, who cared for them and did their best for them. Well, when you watch interviews with German veteran pilots, you will notice an almost universal condemnation of their commander, Hermann Göring. Göring famously kept derailing conversations on tactics and strategy in his high command to talk about stag hunting, was more interested in touring the casinos of Paris than spending time with his troops, had unrealistic expectations of his troops, and mismanaged the German Air Force in general. Compared this to the head of the US bombing command in the Pacific, LeMay, who famously, when it was found out that US bomber pilots, out of fear of being shot down, dropped their bombs prematurely to be able to fly back to base, joined the air raids himself, flying the first plane in formation to encourage his troops. After the Battle of Britain, not only Bomber Command, but the Royal Air Force in general was put under an efficient command, which made the Royal Air Force the most effective of the war, having access to a large pool of trained pilots not only from Britain, but from Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, as well as various free pilots from occupied countries, such as Polish bomber pilots, Belgian fighter pilots, Danish fighter pilots, Dutch submarine hunters, or the free Greek fighter pilots who helped defeat Rommel's air support over North Africa. The Royal Air Force was also capable of finding quick but effective solutions to its problems. When regular bombing tactics proved ineffective in destroying German dams, the Royal Air Force developed a new bomb specialized for that purpose that also succeeded. When the Royal Air Force had to sink the German heavy battleship Tirpitz, they developed a simple bomb shaped and functioned like a dart that was effectively used by its heavy bombers. Also starting from 1941 to 1944, the Royal Air Force conducted hundreds of bandit raids, sending fighter planes and light bombers over occupied French and Belgian airfields after dark to wait for the return of German fighters who had been sent to intercept Allied bombers, and shot them down in surprise ambush attacks as they were landing. The Germans, due to High Command's incompetence, never had an effective answer to this British tactic. The Royal Air Force actively worked on becoming the most dominant air force, whittling down German numbers to such an extent that by 1944 the German Air Force was unable to provide any kind of air cover to fight against the invading Allied forces on D-Day. While the German Air Force, with its commanders' incompetence and blind belief in their own supposed natural superiority, gradually whittled away, being barely relevant, let alone effective, as a fighting force at 1944. And the coordination of bombing tactics with ground movement is where you find the most important reason for why the bombing of Dresden happened. Some of you watching this may have already started asking a question concerning this video a few minutes ago. What was the purpose of dehousing Dresden when it didn't have the industrial relevance as, for example, various cities of the Ruhr Valley? The reason for that, which is the main reason why Dresden was bombed in the first place, is Budapest, more specifically the Battle of Budapest, that many of you probably never heard of. Because of the Cold War, the struggles and battles of the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Red Army are often not told in our popular history in documentaries and books. In October 1944, the Soviet army entered Hungary, advanced towards Budapest, where starting in late December, the battle for the Hungarian capital city started. The offensive and subsequent battle for Budapest was a brutal, sluggish mess, drawing out through one of Europe's coldest winters. It dragged on for 4 long months, as the Red Army surrounded the city, fought off German relief attempts, and then had to clear the city house by house and street by street, until the defending forces attempted a breakout. The Germans would lose 280,000 soldiers, the Red Army 251,000 soldiers, with 76,000 dead civilians. In March 1945, after the Battle of Budapest had come to its bloody conclusion, the Red Army broke out of Poland and into Germany. Throughout this, the Red Army had to continuously engage in long, drawn-out and costly house-to-house combat in the cities and streets of Danzig, Königsberg, Poznan, Breslau, Stettin. In most of these cities, the battles raged for months. In Breslau, Danzig and Königsberg, fighting would continue from February into April and even into May. The Nazis had mobilized children, women, and the elderly in the regime's final stand, and every inch gained by the Red Army came at a tremendous cost, as hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, German soldiers, and civilians were killed in these offensives and battles. The bombing of Dresden happened because it was requested by the Soviet army and Stalin, who had hoped that the destruction of the city would prevent the kind of long, drawn-out house-to-house combat and consequent casualties that had occurred in Budapest and were still ongoing in many cities the Red Army was fighting in. If you search for a Battle of Dresden in 1945, you will find no results. The reason being that the bombing had in the end prevented such a battle. The Red Army arrived in the outskirts of Dresden on the 5th of May 1945 and took the city on the 6th, with no resistance. The remaining buildings were covered in white flags of surrender. Footage of this is barely ever shown, let alone seen. It is therefore possible to argue that the bombing of Dresden prevented a long, drawn-out battle for the city. If you compare the casualties of the bombing with the casualties of the various battles of the Red Army that it had to fight for cities, it even makes the bombing campaigns look preferable. But it isn't the civilian casualties that the planners of the bombing cared about. It would be wrong to assume that the planners had a moral incentive to spare the people of Dresden a long, drawn-out and brutal siege by bombing them. They merely wished to clear a path for the Red Army, to bring the war to a quicker end. It is somewhat ironic that this bombing, which was intended to support the war effort of the Soviet Union, was later co-opted and used by the Soviet bloc to condemn the very countries who they had asked for this bombing, and thereby created a myth that perpetuates to this day. After going through all the reasons for why the bombing of Dresden happened, and showing you the background story for why it is an event that still perpetuates and is used in debate to this day, there is an underlying point that I wish to make as I come to the end of this video, about the futility and nonsensical nature of the debate over morality of these actions. There's a tragedy in the bombing campaigns of Europe, but one of the main reasons why the debate of the morality of the bombings is a sham is because you will never hear about the bombing of Hamburg, the bombing of Cologne, or the bombing of Berlin as much as you will hear about the bombing of Dresden. The bombing of Berlin being an absolute failure, as the heavy air defenses of Berlin resulted in massive casualties for the Allies, with only little damage being done to the city itself. So let me ask this: if the bombing of German cities was a moral evil, was the Nazi victory in the air war over Berlin a moral good? Goebbels noted in his diary after the bombing of Cologne that if there are 4 more Colognes, they would lose the war. The bombing campaigns forced the German war industry to move its production locations into different areas, mainly into the south. With the start of the bombing campaigns in Austria and Bavaria in late 1943, those production locations had to be moved again underground and into other disclosed and hidden areas. Even though production was not substantially halted by the bombing, the resulting logistical costs of moving production had a negative impact on the German war effort, consequently shortening the war. So was it a moral good? Another reason why I don't take debates over the morality over the Allied bombings during World War II serious, and why you shouldn't either, is Japan. With Japan specifically, the nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are clear examples of bombing leading to a victory and an end of the war. But even though there is still in some areas a debate about the morality of dropping the nuclear bombs, there's one chapter of the Allied bombing campaign in Japan that is consistently ignored or barely ever brought up, namely the bombings before Hiroshima. After the capture of Tinian and Saipan by US Marines in August 1944, the airbase established there put mainland Japan in reach of the US heavy bomber fleet. Japanese fighters stationed in Iwo Jima would still harass these bombers en route. However, by 1944, the Japanese Zero was an outdated plane and its pilots were mainly young and inexperienced. After the capture of Iwo Jima, not only did Japan lose that fighter base, but it gave the Americans a closer range airbase from which more bombers and even fighters could reach Japan. Japan had no buffers such as an occupied Belgium or Netherlands from which to intercept American planes. Its air force ran out of fuel and pilots faster than Germany. In summary, it had even less protection from US air raids than Germany, and the American bombings of Japan dwarfed the bombings conducted in Germany. Over the course of 38 months, 3.4 million tons of bombs were dropped over Germany, killing between 300,000 and 600,000 people. Over the course of 20 months, the Americans dropped 157,000 tons of bombs over Japan, killing the same amount of people. The bombs dropped over German cities were steel-cased thermite bombs. During a bombing raid over Germany, the first wave of bombers would drop bright burning tracers, marking out targets. The second wave would drop high explosives that would blow the tiles off roofs. And the bomber waves that came afterwards would drop the steel casings filled with thermite, which would drop into the houses themselves after the roofs had been blown off, ignite and burn a path through the building straight into its foundation, setting everything along the way ablaze. In Japan, however, bombing was mainly conducted by the Americans, who in 1942 had the idea of using the newly invented petroleum jelly mix used as ammunition in flamethrowers, called napalm, in bombs. Tons of napalm was dropped over Japan between 1944 and 1945. The Japanese cities were largely built out of wood and paper, and the coastal winds would drive the fires far out through the cities and into the suburbs. In a shorter amount of time, the Americans managed to do more damage in Japan with less bombs than the British had to Germany over a longer amount of time. During Allied bombing of Germany, 33% of Berlin was destroyed, 61% of Cologne, 54% of Dortmund, 59% of Dresden, 64% of Düsseldorf, 50% of Essen, 52% of Frankfurt, 75% of Hamburg, 20% of Leipzig, and 42% of Munich. During American bombing raids of Japan, 51% of Tokyo was destroyed, 99% of Toyama, 86% of Fukui, 85% of Tokushima, 80% of Fukuyama, 71% of Gifu, 69% of Okayama, 63% of Kagoshima, 64% of Imabari, 56% of Kobe. And one major difference between the firebombings of Japanese cities and German cities is that the fires mainly spread through the civilian parts of the cities that were built of wood and paper, destroyed small industry, killed civilians, and left the heavy industries only lightly damaged. The ruins of Tokyo don't even compare to the ruins of Dresden. 50 square miles of houses built out of wood and paper burnt to the ground. Over 1 million were left homeless. Over 100,000 Japanese civilians, men, women, and children, burnt to death. 50% of the city's industry was destroyed, and all of it during one single night. Keep in mind that the bombing of Dresden killed 25,000 in comparison. The worst bombing of a German city, the bombing of Hamburg, killed 42,000 over the course of 2 days. Some would even argue that the bombing of Tokyo was worse than the bombing of Hiroshima. However, you barely hear of the firebombing of Tokyo, neither in popular history or in debates about the supposed efficacy and morality of bombing. It's because there was nothing to be gained from it during the Cold War. In the case of Japan, it is clear beyond the shadow of a doubt that bombing ended the war, making a land invasion of Japan and its estimated millions of dead unnecessary. Japan was not occupied by Soviet troops. There was nothing to be gained out of a politicization of the firebombings of Japanese cities, unlike the bombing of German cities, where it should stand out that the bombing of West German cities such as Hamburg and Cologne was in fact worse than the bombing of East German cities. Proportionality is a guideline of war. When LeMay, Harris, and other commanders organized their bombing raids, they did so under guidances of proportionality. Bombing raids that had losses that were not compliable with the damage done on ground, such as by daylight or over Berlin or from air bases in China, were abandoned. A bottom line is that the questions over the morality of burning thousands of people alive do not matter in that calculation, as cold as it may sound. What mattered was bringing an end to the war. What mattered in war was to stop the enemy with as few losses to your own side as possible. An air raid over a Japanese city destroyed that city, but at a loss rate of 4% of planes per raid, several American bombers and their crews would still get shot down. When the option became available to wipe out an entire Japanese city with only 2 planes and 1 single bomb, the rules of proportionality that guide war made this an option that could not be declined. It shows that the picking of specific events such as the bombing of Dresden and Hiroshima are nothing but emotional strings by which to pull you in. This, however, completely leaves out of the conversation that a long protracted Battle of Dresden, that in all likelihood would have happened if the bombing hadn't happened, and would have been fought by Soviet troops, would have probably resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, German and Soviet, as it had done in prior sieges and battles of cities. And that without the bombing of Japan, a ground invasion would have probably killed millions. Even more so, it ignores a simple question, but one that is vital and important in all of this. What if the Allies had lost a war? What if the Germans had the same capacity to wage war as the Allies did? Do you believe the Germans would have showed the rest of the world a compassion that the Allies for some reason would have supposedly refused? I doubt it. In fact, I believe it is fair to say that the Nazi regime would have eagerly inflicted far worse upon the world if they had the capacity to do so. What do you think would a German bombing of New York would have looked like? What do you think would a Japanese bombing of Los Angeles would have looked like? But coming back to the proportionalities of war, the guidelines of proportionality that guide generals and commanders in their campaigns during war should also show to you why the debates that bring up the supposed morality behind bombing of cities like Dresden, Hiroshima and other to be hollow. What exactly is a moral tactic during war? What is a morally good tactic of war? What exactly is good in war? Doesn't that put the idea into the room that there is something like a morally good war? Is there a good war? I personally don't believe so. To quote the American author Sam Hines, who himself was a Navy pilot during the Battle of Okinawa, there is no such thing as a good war. But this was a war of which it is good that one side won it. War is an act of barbarism. It's ultimately an act in which we consciously remove the veneer of civilization, the guidelines and laws of civilization. There is no civilized way of killing someone, and there is no morality to be found within the process of killing someone. Consequently, there is no morality to be found in war. The shoebox is a mine invented by the Germans and widely deployed. It's unique in that it's small, made of wood, and with barely any metal pieces, making it undetectable for mine detectors. But far more sinister about it, it's intentionally made small with a smaller amount of explosives that are less likely to kill a person that is stepping on it. The explosives inside are just enough to rip a man's foot off, and the mine was intentionally designed as such. The calculation behind it being that a severely injured and crippled soldier would cost the Allies far more in funds that could otherwise be invested into the war effort than a dead soldier who could have simply been buried. This seems inhuman to us, immoral, and almost just outright evil. But nobody was ever charged during the Nuremberg trials or any other subsequent war crime trials for the design, construction, and use of the shoebox. This was not considered to be a crime, but merely a part of war. There are many such examples that I can think of. Up to 60,000 French civilians were killed during Allied bombing raids on France in preparation of and during the D-Day invasions. But you barely ever hear about them, as even among the French public it is seen as an acceptable sacrifice for liberation. From the start of hostilities, the Germans and Italians deliberately targeted and sank British hospital ships, an action that would constitute a war crime under the Hague Conventions. No charges were, however, brought up after the war, because the British reacted by also sinking German and Italian ships, and because the Italians also violated the Hague Convention by using hospital ships to secretly transport ammunition and troops. In the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers were put under direct instructions to single out and target and kill medics first, to leave other American soldiers without medical attention. One aspect of World War II that is obviously evil but barely ever discussed is the use of child soldiers by the Germans. On all sides of the war, flamethrower operators who were captured or who surrendered were simply shot, which was also simply accepted as a part of war. And in many ways, examples from World War II are just as relevant today. White phosphorus is an easily flammable chemical that is hard to put out and that produces a thick white smoke. It was often used by Allied troops to create smoke screens to hide positions and restrict enemy view. However, white phosphorus is also extremely effective when used as a weapon. Fired into an enemy position, clots of white phosphorus would stick to clothes and skin, burn through the flesh, and keep on burning, basically slowly frying a human being alive from the inside out. Imagine being the commander of an American armored infantry platoon, entering a town in Germany in early 1945. Suddenly, a German machine gun opens fire on your position from a building that from the looks of it also has civilians in it. Do you use 2 squads of soldiers, 20 to 38 men in the flanking maneuver, risking several of them getting killed? Or do you order a Sherman tank to roll up and fire a phosphorus shell into the building from a distance, not risking any of your men, but resulting in everyone in that building, including any possible civilians in there, dying a slow and very gruesome death? Move this forward into 1965. You're commanding a squad of Marines approaching a Vietnamese village, from which mortar shells have been fired into your base 30 minutes ago. Do you enter the village with your squad and risk running into an ambush? Or do you call in an airstrike, dropping several gallons of napalm, burning the entire village to the ground, but risking severe civilian casualties? You can move this situation into every single of the most recent conflicts, and it illustrates the most important factor in all of this. The decisions made by Allied commanders that have led to the deaths of civilians during World War II are often the result of a calculation of proportionality. Allied military commanders at war didn't make their decisions on the basis of moral questions, but on the basis of calculating if the decision may bring unnecessary risk to those under their command, or if civilian victims are worth being made for the desired outcome. I mentioned above that I find the entire debate of the morality of the bombing of Dresden and of the Allied bombing campaign in general to be worthless and nonsensical. I gave you examples for why it made sense militarily, what the reasoning behind the bombing campaign was, why it happened, why it didn't make the Allies just as bad or worse than the Axis, the motivations of the Air Force, the reason it is brought up in the first place, because of an authoritarian propaganda myth that is kept alive and perpetuated. But really the most important point in this, in the end, is that war is an uncivilized act. War can't be good. There can't be a good war. There's no moral way of killing a human being. Only the reason for fighting a war can be good. As such, the quest for some morality within something that is fundamentally barbaric is pointless. And something nobody ever seems to point out is that especially the bombing of Dresden resurfaces as an issue and is brought up again and again in debates about the supposed morality of it, especially here in Germany, by extremists who praise it as a supposed moral good or condemn it as a supposed moral evil, by extremists who themselves argue their views from a position of conflict, who argue their views and their ideology in terms of war. In short, it's argued by people who themselves wish to escape the civilizing rules that bind our modern democratic politics together in our civilization, who themselves wish to remove the veneer of civilization and engage in the kind of tactics that civilization decries and condemns. It is therefore not only pointless, but also hypocritical.